Bruce, his wife Katie, his son who's in from California, Jeremy, and the rest of the Miller family, and to all of you. Well, I've been given the honor of greeting all of you here tonight to introduce my partner, Bruce Sherwood. After 50 plus years in the practice of law, Bruce has decided to move on to the next phase of his life. And I know we all wish him and Katie one that is long, happy, and fulfilling. I would be remiss, though, if I did not at this point state that the bar and the accused in our area are losing a fierce, extremely well-prepared, experienced, and superior advocate. And may I add, parenthetically, that when you're charged with a crime, you need a lawyer with those attributes. And Bruce has always been that lawyer, performing tirelessly year after year, and may I add, always with a sense of style and a great deal of command. Speaking personally, I will miss his presence in our office, as well as his wisdom, his counsel, and his advice. For though our law practices are very different, I've tapped into those resources any number of times over the years. Bruce is, and has always been, a trusted partner and my friend. Bruce, to you, professional life well lived, and a job very well done. Good luck, and a great life ahead. Both to you and Katie.
Salud.
And at this time, I'm going to deliver a message from our last living named partner of our firm, Martin D. Cohen. Bruce, this is Mr. Cohen. It is most fitting that the firm is honoring Bruce as he retires from the practice of law. It is a firm belief of all of us that he has reached this point after many, many years of dedication and hard work. Some history is necessary, though. When Bruce came to the office, the other lawyers, Kevin Cooper Sr., Art Ecker Sr., and I, had concluded that what we needed was an individual who practiced civil litigation with an emphasis on personal injury. We made that rather clear to Bruce. and here I'll use a fancy legal term, he demurred to hear the other person out, resulting in his reputation that has not been equaled in the criminal law area in lower Luzerne County. He was right for another reason. A lawyer who is unhappy at what he is doing makes a very poor lawyer. It is my hope and my prayer that he and Katie will have a long, satisfying, but challenging period of retirement. I know that those of us who have come to admire his work will recognize his ability in ways that those who are not lawyers are unable to do. The admiration for his ability by his fellow lawyers is an indication of that. To Bruce and Kate, my best wishes for that wonderful golden age that I had so much enjoyed. Marty.
Very nice.
At this time, without further fanfare or ado, I give you my partner and my friend, Bruce Miller, Esquire.
So if anybody has to key in, because this could be a while. See how's the lighting. Okay, I would like to welcome all of you this evening and thank you for giving of your time and making the effort to experience this retirement party with me. Especially those of you who have traveled from distances, including State College, including Pittsburgh, including New York, and including Santa Monica. I am humbled by your efforts on my behalf. This retirement has been a long time in coming. I've thought about it for several years, but really didn't feel that I was old enough to retire. A couple of years ago, I was in court in another jurisdiction, and a colleague came up to me and he said, "Oh, you're still doing this?" And I thought, crazy saying that. You know, do I look that old? And I thought it was an anomaly. And then I started to hear it more and more. And so I thought, I don't know, maybe it is the time. Anyway, about 3 months ago, we started planning for this evening. And I knew that I would have an opportunity to speak. And so I started thinking about the past 50 years, what led me to my calling as an attorney, what led me to a criminal defense attorney, a civil libertarian, as distinguished from a prosecutor or a corporate attorney. When I was in high school, I had considered becoming a doctor. However, my 11th grade physics teacher made it very clear to me that I was not going to be a doctor. So, not a doctor, maybe a lawyer. And so in thinking about how my career developed and evolved, I note that going back, my parents were not particularly activists, although I grew up in a home where my parents were non-discriminatory, were not racist, and I suspect to some extent that that had an influence upon me. I do believe, however, that my Jewish religious education, as well as my involvement with Jewish youth groups, taught me about compassion for those who were less fortunate, for those who were experiencing injustice, either because of the color of their skin, their country of origin, their financial resources, or simply their lack of functionality to deal with their present circumstances. I felt a strong pull towards these people, and I felt that somehow I could help them and make a difference in their lives. And I had a personal experience which I think had an effect upon played a role in my development. Enter about 1959, when I was 16 years old, and there is one person in this room who will recognize this story. I recall having my driver's license for a short period of time, and I was traveling west on Diamond Avenue in the city of Hazleton, near the intersection with Church Street. Just me and my girlfriend. I'm not sure where we were going, but I suspect we were either going to or coming from parking somewhere. And as I came to the red light at the intersection of Diamond Avenue and Church, I took my arm off of the steering wheel and I put it around the seat, or around my girlfriend. In those days, we had what are called bench seats. There are probably a few of you who know what that is, but now we have mostly bench seats. But in those days, in a bench seat, your passenger could sit very close to you. And so, as we stopped at the light, I heard a rap on the window to the left, and I turned, and there's a police officer there, and he's motioning me to roll down my window. And I rolled down my window, and he says, "You know, you nearly pushed me off the road back there. Next time, have two hands on the wheel, and not around your girlfriend." I'm 16 years old. I wasn't going to get in an argument with the cop. I didn't have my parents' information, the registration or the insurance, and the cop said, "Just bring it down to City Hall in the morning." So when I got home, I told my mother what happened, and she said, "Don't tell your father." And she gave me the cards, and the next morning I went down to City Hall to the front desk, and I gave them the cards, and they had no record of my having been stopped. And so I figured, I'm home free. Well, we heard nothing for several weeks, and then finally we received a letter in the mail. My father received a letter in the mail inviting us to appear in juvenile court because of my violation of the motor vehicle code. Needless to say, my father was not very good. There was no discussion with regard to my innocence. There was no discussion with regard to due process. No discussion with regard to the presumption of innocence. Driving was a privilege, and I evidently had violated that privilege, and so there wasn't going to be a lawyer representing me. And so sometime later, my dad and I traveled to Wilkes-Barre Juvenile Court, and there I am in my little black suit and white shirt and my little skinny tie, and I look around, nobody's dressed up, just me, and all these evil-looking delinquents, and I wondered, what am I doing here? What is this all about? Well, we were called in front of the judge, and I don't even remember any discussion about whether I was guilty, whether I was innocent, but the judge asked me for my license. Now, I had heard from my friends that the judge will take your license, he will give you a lecture, and then he'll give you your license back, and you go home. I didn't get my license back. I lost my license for 6 months. And before we left, the judge said, next time you pick a fight, don't do it with a cop. And before I could even realize what was occurring, we're ushered out the door, and there I am thinking, wait a second, I didn't push anybody off the road, I didn't pick a fight with anybody. Is this what our criminal justice system is about? Now, this incident occurred over 60 years ago, and for me to remember it, it certainly must have had an effect upon me, because as I'm sure my partners will tell you, oftentimes I can't remember what happened 2 months ago. So I think that had an effect upon my feeling of injustice. During the summers of my first and second years of law school, I worked for the firm as a summer intern, except for the times that I was rehearsing at Lakewood Musical Theater, and that's a whole other story. My office was in the firm library, and I had a typewriter where I typed my own research and my own pleadings. After graduation, I started working for the firm and did any kind of work that came my way, including criminal work, personal injury defense, personal injury defense insurance. We represented a number of insurance companies. And so in thinking about the past 50 years, I thought what I would do is share with you some of the more memorable cases that I was able to experience. In or about 1969, through the firm's connections, I was hired part-time as a public defender. And that's a position that I maintained for 18 years. In this position, I handled a number of cases that weren't likely to come my way as private counsel. Most of them homicides, rapes, home invasions, robberies, representing gangs and members of gangs. I represented the Aryan Brotherhood. In one of my early homicide cases, my client, who reminded me of Charles Manson, was found guilty of first-degree murder. In a second mini-trial, when there's a finding of first-degree murder, there's a subsequent trial to determine what the penalty will be, whether it will be life or whether it will be death. And fortunately, I was able to convince the jury to choose life. I was very happy, as a young lawyer, to have saved my client's life. However, my client, upon hearing this, bent down, took off his shoe, started yelling and screaming at the jury, and cursing, took off his shoe and threw it into the jury box. And then he got up and he started racing towards the jury box, and he was grabbed by 5 or 6 different sheriffs. In the meantime, I looked over and members of the jury were jumping out of the jury box, not walking out, jumping out and screaming. They thought that the shoe was a bomb. Of course, I was devastated. I just saved my client's life. I didn't get a thank you. Is all of this happening in front of me? It was. In 1974, I represented a young man who had a job delivering pizza in Freeland. He wasn't provided a vehicle, and so he used his own vehicle to deliver pizza. Now, the car had a hole in the driver's seat, and my client covered up the hole with an American flag. Part of it was over the back seat. Police officer passes by, he sees the flag, and he arrests my client for flag desecration. Now, I have great respect for the flag, what it represents, and what it symbolizes, although I gotta tell you, I am not a flag hunter, like some people. In any event, I collected a number of exhibits to present at trial, as you can see from, right here, from this wall hanging. At trial, the judge indicated that he had fought for and he was wounded for that flag. And I argued to the judge that he may have fought for and been wounded for what the flag represents, but not for that flag. That flag was in my client's family's home. He didn't get it. My client was found guilty. I appealed to the Superior Court of Pennsylvania, and the case was reversed, and the flag statute of Pennsylvania was determined to be unconstitutionally void for vagueness. That was kind of a proud day for me. Because I was doing criminal work as a public defender, I started attracting more and more criminal clients. I also began an association with the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU. And some of the early cases that I had through them were dress code cases. And one of the first ones was in the city of Hazleton. A young man in junior high school was about to be suspended because he had fringes on the bottom of his jeans. I met with the principal and I tried to understand what the thinking was here as to why this would be such a violation that he couldn't continue in school. I never got a satisfactory answer except that the principal said to me, "Bruce, he had fringes on his jeans, and that's going to disrupt the educational process." And I just couldn't get how that would be so. In Pittston, I represented a young man who was suspended from the swim team because he wore blue jeans to school and because of his hair. We had a meeting with the school board, and the school board said they would allow my client to wear black jeans. They would allow him to wear green jeans. They would allow him to wear khaki jeans, but he couldn't wear blue jeans. And when I tried to get an answer of why he couldn't wear blue jeans, since all the other jeans were acceptable, I really didn't get a response that made any sense. And with regard to his hair, the solicitor for the school board had my client stand up and put his head back and said to me, "See, Attorney Miller, when he puts his head back, his hair is touching the collar of his shirt." And I, is this real? Is this really happening? Again, I couldn't get a satisfactory response from them as to why this was occurring. And unfortunately, these were not the kind of cases that the ACLU at that time was prepared to take the litigation, and the clients' families were not willing to do that as well. What we did is we worked out an accommodation, and we moved on. And at that time, his hair was really, really not that long. And speaking of hair, I remember pleading a client guilty in front of a judge who's not here this evening. And I was standing next to my client, and after he pled guilty, the judge pointed to him and he said, "And when you come back here for sentencing, you better get your hair cut." And I looked over at my client, and at that time my hair was down to my shoulder. His hair was substantially shorter than mine. And I figured, he's trying to tell me something. I didn't get my hair cut. He did, I didn't. Through the ACLU, in both state and federal courts, I began to represent a number of young people who were members of religious groups and who had been kidnapped from these organizations against their will. They were whisked off to facilities known as deprogramming centers, where the goal was to lecture them and deprogram them away from the groups that they were interested in. My clients in those regards were the Church of Scientology, the International Society of Krishna Consciousness, known as the Hare Krishnas, as well as the Unification Church, pejoratively known as the Moonies. These were absolutely incredibly interesting cases, very challenging. During a Hare Krishna custody case, I spent a week at a Krishna farm in Juniata County, living with these people, most of whom, by the way, were very bright, very educated, and very devoted to their religion. My client and her 2 young sons were living at the farm. The boys were like 5 and 7, and they were thriving. They were going to school on the farm, and they had a lot of friends. However, the children's father and grandparents hired a couple of thieves to kidnap the children from the farm to get them away from the farm. So we had a trial for approximately, I would say it was 7 or 8 days. Fortunately, I was able to get my client's children back to her. It was an extraordinary experience for me, one of the more emotional cases that I handled. Several times during the trial, the judge had to admonish me to keep my voice down. I know you can't. It's hard to understand. One of the interesting things about that case is that one day I appeared in court in the morning, and my opponent, some of you know, shows up, and he brought the sheriff of Juniata County into court. And the judge came out of his chambers and comes onto the bench, and he says, "What's the sheriff doing here?" And my opponent says, "I asked the sheriff to be here because I want Attorney Miller to be criminally arrested for a violation of the Pennsylvania Wiretap Act." That had to do with a piece of evidence in the case. I was absolutely outraged, and the judge just said, "Nobody's getting arrested." Sent the sheriff back to his office and proceeded with the trial. In my experience, I've also had the joy and the challenge of being involved in some high-profile cases, one of which was an alleged poisoning. I guess it's not alleged anymore. I owe a debt of gratitude for that case to my good friend Frank Macedo, who retained me to handle that part of the case dealing with hair testing, where hair follicles were being tested to determine the presence, not only the presence of chemicals, but when the chemicals were embedded into the hair follicles. Despite all the pressures, the late nights, the clients who failed to pay, still failed to pay, or failed to listen to my advice, I have been blessed to enjoy my 50 years as a lawyer. I believe that I have affected many lives, and I believe that I have helped change many lives for the better. A successful career as a lawyer doesn't happen in a vacuum. There are a number of people who contributed to my success over the years, and I do want to recognize them for their help along the way. During law school, my life became very structured, which still continues. I worked hard, I studied a lot. At that time, we lived across the street from the Army War College in Carlisle, and every night at 11 o'clock they would play taps. And this was kind of a reminder or a warning to me that if I didn't succeed in law school, I may very well wind up in jail. During those law school years, and for a number of years in the early 70s, I was emotionally and financially supported by Susan Miller, to whom I was married at the time. Susan, I would like to thank you for all of your support. I really appreciate you being there. Without your support and encouragement, I am not sure that I would have been able to make it through those 3 grueling years of law school. And I would also like to especially thank you for raising and nourishing our son into the beautiful man he has become. I would like to acknowledge my mentor, Martin Cohn, who encouraged me, guided me, corrected me with the goal of serving my clients in the best possible way. He stressed through preparation and communication with clients and in everything that I did to recognize that I am a reflection upon the firm of Victor Bayless, Ecker & Company. I'd like to recognize my partners, Rob Sensky and John Gallagher, who have been sounding boards for me every day I come into the office. A number of years ago, Rob took over the reins as managing partner and has done an excellent job in reorganizing the firm. Over 5 years ago, we were faced with being homeless, inasmuch as the building that we had our offices in since 1953 was being sold, and we were out of luck. It was very difficult to find a suitable location for our office. After much searching, Rob came up with our present space, which we are very happy with. He organized the entire move, including the remodeling of the premises. On behalf of the firm, yes, I would also like to thank Lori in that regard as well. On behalf of the entire firm, we would like to thank Rob and Lori for their efforts on keeping our firm thriving. And I would also like to thank Rob and the members of the firm who were involved in hosting this party this evening. I mentioned him before, but I again would like to recognize my good friend and colleague Frank Nacito, who's probably the most well-respected criminal defense lawyer at our bar. Frank is a former president of the Pennsylvania Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. Frank knew and knows everybody. He is the nicest guy you'd ever want to meet. He's always and often been there for me to discuss different criminal cases that I have. Thank you, Frank.
2 times.
Since the mid-'80s, I have been blessed to have my beautiful wife, Kate, by my side. She has experienced or should I say, endured many late nights, many bad moods. Not only did she and does she support my legal practice, but she is also the property manager for our home and for the properties that we own, thus relieving me from a great deal of stress. Kate is a beautiful and compassionate human being, and I have been very blessed to have her in my life. Thank you, honey. I will also want to acknowledge our support staff, Lori, Allie, and Marie. Without you guys, neither I nor the firm would have experienced the success that we have. Last, but certainly not least, I want to thank Tammy, my work wife. My legal assistant, my good friend for over 37 years. I could not have serviced my clients without him. She knows all the different procedures. She has all the right forms for the counties that I practice. She knows who to talk to in the various counties. Everybody loves her. She's got a wonderful personality. She's great with all the clients that we deal with, and I've always been able to rely on her to get things done. Tammy, birthday girl, today is her birthday. I want to thank you for all that you have done and do for me and for the children. I truly appreciate it. We are blessed to have your smiling face every day. Leading you is going to be the hardest part of this retirement. I mean that.
I'm gonna miss you.
I will truly miss you. We're not done yet. We have 2 cases on Monday, we've got 3 cases on Tuesday, and life goes on. I want to thank all of you for coming here to experience this occasion with me and the beginning of the new chapter in my life. Thank you very much.
Good luck.